I would like to ask the AG to propose legislation for what we call small claims court. There are lots of poor people, to an example you just gave, that they have issues with others and sometimes with large firms, but the lawyer fee is greater than the fee you're claiming.
It is their
right.
Unlike the right that someone has, all our rights exist in context.
What is the context of a second medical opinion?
Because of disrespect to the process.
No.
Jesus, this is common sense, man.
Any situation which you seem to do, you're just dealing with Afro Guyanese issues. If one, you can't bring and pull the leaders of the African community together, you're failing. And if two, you can't put forward a vision, a blueprint, and a plan for African Guyanese, you're failing as well.
Pleasant Wednesday evening to you. This is the Freddie Kissoon Show. Thanks for being with us. Our co-host is Leonard, of course. And this evening, we will be discussing Dr. Rupert Roopnarine. Dr. Roopnarine came back in 1976 in Guyana and immediately got involved in the Working People's Alliance through the instrumentality of his friend Walter Rodney. They knew each other from 1976 until 2015, May 2015, Rupert Roopnarine was involved in opposition politics. From 1976 to 2019, when he retired from politics, those are more than 40 years. In that time, Dr. Rupert Roopnarine has chalked up a lot of admiration, but simultaneously a lot of controversies. One of the persons that publicly criticized Rupert Roopnarine in the letter pages of the newspapers and on the Freddie Kissoon Show is Ravi, whom I described yesterday as one, in my column yesterday, as one of Guyana's foremost intellectuals. And you may not like Dev's politics, the direction of his politics, but you cannot deny the man's intellectual reach, just as though you cannot deny the brilliance of Rupert Roopnarine, but you could disagree with his politics. Mr. Dev has made several criticisms of Rupert Roopnarine, but the two that are in the public domain is that several times he said in the letter pages of all the newspapers, Dr. Roopnarine sabotaged the coming together of a center force as proposed by Ravi Dev, so that in the 2006 elections, you can have all the small parties come together as a wedge between the PPP and the PNC. And Mr. Dev did not mince his words. He said Rupert Roopnarine was sabotaging the talks, and he complained to the WPA. He named Clive Thomas and Moses Bagwan about Roopnarine's behavior, but apparently there was no reaction. Then Mr. Dev on this program said that Roopnarine told him he's more comfortable in the company of African Guyanese than Indians. That may have something to do with Roopnarine's cultural character. Mr. will explain about that. So, here tonight to give us his take on one of Guyana's most enduring politicians, enduring politicized intellectuals, is former member of parliament and former leader of a party that won a seat in parliament, ROAR. So, without further ado, thanks Leonard for being here. Ravi, I don't think an hour will suffice for such a controversial and enduring figure. But we'd like you to spend an hour just as people have dissected Burnham, dissected Rodney, dissected Jagan, and a whole set of other people. Can you dissect Roopnarine for us?
Well, as you said, Rupert has had a long and, in many instances, a very significant role in politics in Guyana's modern politics. So yeah, we're going to try to give him it justice and give his service justice. But you've identified two areas to speak about him. But I want to understand that this isn't just personally about Rupert, that in reviewing Rupert or any other historical figure or historical event, the point of it is to afford us an opportunity to glean some lessons for our actions. So that is my perspective in talking about Rupert. So based on what Freddie thrown out, two topics that we could talk about in which Rupert was involved in. One was a new political arrangement to enter into the 2006 elections. That I was in Parliament in 2001. We won a seat and I represented Roar in Parliament, and it was a very significant era because the PPP was consolidating its rule, so to speak. But more importantly, we had just come out of the first significant set of constitutional reform in 2000, and so this was going to be the Parliament that was going to try to implement, up to that point, what politics in Guyana was going to be all about. So coming back to the politics of coalition, my proposal at that point was that and there were several. There was Roar, there was a WPA, there was GAP, this boy who now runs Go Invest, Peter Ramsroop had a party. You had Joey Jagan had something called a Unity Party. So it was a very, very diverse group. So my point was that, in fact, let's not call it a third force, which in a sense, gives you an order for a second, third. Let's call it a center force. And that was meant to also signal the fact that we would remain in the center, that we acknowledge that you had two behemoths in Guyana's politics, the PPP and the PNC, that we would now take a center force, that we would then act for what is better for Guyana. In fact, the early AFC, we tried to get them to join in this also, and there were some discussions, but they were never in part of the formal head. We had worked out, I personally had worked out on a program, the skeleton of a program for this. And Rupert and I spent time over this. And I'll never forget, one of my things was that we should have something to the effect of respecting the divinity, in terms of politics in Guyana. And Rupert asked me, Ravi, why would we want to bring in the God in this whole matter? And my point is that I said of individuals not trying to assume any kind of totality of knowledge over everything, but yet that's the problem in Guyana, that both these two behemoths feel they know everything. So if we just throw that in, it implies that we are, in that sense, not having supreme knowledge. I'll forget it. We never went ahead with it, but that was one point I want to make. This is where the matter became cloudy. We had worked on the effort to bring us together, and we were at the point, in my estimate, where I was now the chairman. We had a rotating chair, adopting that from the WPA. And I was the chair, and we had come to a point where we now were going to be taking a vote as to who would go forward in a coalition. And Rupert was not available for that meeting. And then I was told by Hardy of GAP that his information was that Rupert had met individuals outside of Guyana and that they were not going to be part of this. So lo and behold, we raised this matter inside. And since Rupert was not there, we had talked to, when Rupert came back, we heard of the PNC being part of a broader rainbow coalition. And in fact, Joey also, from within the group, supported that. And also, from within the group, supported that. And the long and short of it, while it was never publicly acknowledged that the WPA was supporting the PNC, which was one of the forces we were supposed to be in the middle of, that it was Rupert Roopnarine that led the efforts of the WPA to be aligned with the PNC. And we saw and we heard, and it is now acknowledged, that by 2011, it was Rupert that put together the APNU.
The second issue that Freddie brought up, which was with respect to Dr. Roopnarine saying that he is more comfortable among Afro-Guyanese. And Freddie attribute that to personal knowledge that you have or a personal conversation. What I would like to delve deeper into is to ask you if that you would consider that something socially or politically awkward for an East Indian man to declare unashamedly that he is comfortable among Afro-Guyanese.
Well, very frankly, I see nothing wrong, nothing askance, if one was to tell their truth, which I think Rupert was telling me. And the phrase he used, being a literary man, was an alliteration. I am more comfortable in Mackenzie than in Mahaika, implying
Right.
what those two communities represented. And I saw nothing in and of itself, anything wrong. Having grown up in a mixed village of Iflat, if it were not for the riots of the 1960s, which split us apart, I literally grew up in Kashmir, the African section of my village, and my closest friends and socialization patterns were in that section. And we come back to that, what missed all of that and maybe where he felt. My seeing it as a problematic was because we had a run-in with the WPA on this matter, where the WPA proposed as a foundational matter that they were a multi-ethnic grouping. And here it was that Rupert Roopnarine was telling me that he was, quote unquote, he didn't see himself as an Indian. And, he saw himself much more aligned in terms of cultural values with, African values. But I felt he really meant Creole values, that, as Freddie has made the term very, very popular. So my content was not with Rupert, but that he was being used and had been used by the WPA as a stalking horse for representing a community that, in that sense, was an ethnic community, and that must be taken into consideration. And it is very fortuitous that Moses Bagwan has just come out with his book, because he was a founding member of the not Rupert. Rupert came in 76. The WPA was founded in 74. And even before 74,
you had Mao,
you had IPRA and Askria cooperating on some land issues on the East Coast, which brought them together. And Moses Bagwan talks.
Was the founder of IPRA, Indian Political
Revolutionary Associates. So in this book, if you were to read it, which I skimmed through last night.
Oh, the book is out?
It's out, yeah.
So you can get it from Austin Bookstore?
No, I'm sure. I got a soft copy. I'm not rich as you, Freddie, so I had
you
to...
got a copy off the internet?
Off the internet, so I could see it. So, but the point that Moses made is exactly the point that I had made in the press before the 1992 elections, that we had put out a newsletter called the Jaguar, because we had a little group called Jaguar Committee for Democracy, And someone had put out the point that, made the point that Rodney, that with collective leadership, you had the 1985 candidates for the WPA was Clive Thomas as the presidential candidate and Rupert Roopnarine as the prime ministerial candidate. But here comes 1992, and rather than rotating, Clive was once again being put up as the presidential candidate. And somebody wrote us a letter saying that it looks like Rupert is being shafted. And the WPA took very great issue with that, even though it was a letter, right, to our paper. They felt it was our position. But what the point that was being made was that Rupert was very comfortable as to what he saw that. And it was Moses Bhagwan, who took out a full-page ad in the Stabroek News denouncing myself and Beturam and the other individuals in the JCD as being tribalist. He used that word tribalist for taking a position. But in his book, he now accepts that was the basis on which the WPA had been founded. That he was an Indian leader, Kwayana was the African leader. This is before Walter came back, just before Walter came back. And he, in the book, talks very frankly that he, unlike Mr. Kwayana, was not culturally oriented, and IPRA did not address the cultural question as Asquia had done. So in a sense, he was accepting us. So 2 points, and in his book he acknowledges the importance of to your world view, to how you are seen, you know. And this is where my problem with Rupert was, that he was still allowing himself to be called an Indian representative when he was exposed to a man who no Indian has ever spoken out against. Because why? Walter very frankly understood and dealt with the cultural question, and Walter said overtly that before you can be have a Guyanese culture, each ethnic group should become who they are, so they would not look defensively at each other. So this was the hold me, lose me kind of approach that the WPA, in my interaction with them after I returned in 1988-89 to Guyana, had, and that I had a problem with. So it was not Rupert per se. Rupert always, to a great extent, never personally said he was an Indian, or anything. Like I said, he took the other reverse. But he was being used in that sense, and he allowed himself to be used and never took a position on the issue.
Okay, but let's bring in Freud here. None of us are Freudian, competent Freudian, but we've all, sometime in our academic career, had to study Freud. Why would someone be involved with Dr. Walter Rodney? Why would someone be exposed to living abroad and socializing with West Indian politicians, liberal white politicians, would say he is more comfortable among Africans? He did say he's more comfortable in Linden and Mahaika. And I think you could extrapolate that to mean a predominantly African enclave rather than a predominantly Indian enclave. But you were not at the Day of Appreciation for Rupert. Here are what two of the... One of the speakers, Wazir Muhammad, said he lived with Rupert at a house in Queenstown. And sometimes Rupert would get up at 1 o'clock in the night and say, hey, come, let's go to Buxton. Then, in his tribute, David Hines said, man, all the Buxtonian youths liked him even more than my children, and used to call him uncle. Now, those are two references to Buxton. None of them, no one said, well, Rupert said, man, let's go to Edmore, let's go to Annandale. Deeper into the mulatto Creole culture, which is informed by, I think, Anglo-Saxon Western values. But most of all, informed by this narrative that they were the logical inheritors of the colonial state after the colonials left. And it should be a Creole-run state. And I'm wondering if, because Rupert was immersed in that kind of culture. I've known Rupert since 1976. I was a founding member of the WPA as a UG student. And I could look at people that I socialized with 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. You could look at them, not only I, but any one of us with some level of education and analytical skill, could look at them and tell what is the cultural stream they're happy with, what kind of cultural milieu they would like to operate in. And I've always seen Rupert as more immersed in that mulatto Creole Western values than anywhere near Amerindians. I mean, you were very cynical, and I appreciate your cynicalness when you said in your column last week, the Guyana Times, that the WPA said Rupert had appreciated Indian people because he made a film on the Kovajan Ashram. And you quite cynically, I think you were being cynical, said, so if Francis Ford Coppola made a film about the mafia, he is a mafia man. So I've watched it, Rupert, from 19... I've never seen a mental comfort among Indian people, Indian working class people. And so when Wazir Muhammad said he woke him up 1 o'clock to go to Buxton, when David Hines said the children in Buxton call him uncle, how did the children of Port Morant and Annandale felt about Rupert?
Well, here again, Freddie, I want to come back and bring the discussion to where I really want it should be led. That not just Rupert's personal inclination or idiosyncrasy, but what it meant for Guyanese politics and what it meant for him being put up as an Indian politician. And to my great surprise, the individual who made that argument about Rupert being Indian because he made that film on Kovan John Ashram was UC Quayana, the quintessential Africanist from the word go, from Asri, that called for partition, all the way to Asquia, from all the way going back. So the point is that to me displays a kind of cynicism. And I was very disappointed when Mr. Quayana did that, because I wrote a letter in the press, it's there in the Starbuck News archives, taking on Mr. Quayana for that claim. And I must say I might have been a bit rude, which I am not, but I really felt that, you know, somewhere he had crossed the line to try to pull this wool over our eyes. But to come back to Rupert's upbringing and what the whole Creole orientation meant, I want to contrapose him with Walter, who came out of South Georgetown, I think Ben Street.
Wrote books in Africa.
Right, not only that, but the point is that when Rupert told me about his upbringing, understand, when you contrapose him with Walter, who could be just as bright, just as formidable as an intellect, and even more so in my estimation than Rupert. Because Rupert, you got to understand, when you pick up some details that were said at the event there and what Rupert told me himself. When my son entered Queen's College at the age of 9, right? The youngest ever to enter Queen's College, right? He was 9 and so Rupert called me. He said, Ravi, that I also entered Queen's very, younger, and you watch out when this young kid goes there. In terms of how he will read that, because those boys will be older than him and so on and so forth. And my son and I have talked a lot about what his Queen's experience is. Rupert's point was that though his mother, I think, was a teacher, that they were very close to the PPP. His father was a communist. So in terms of who he was, his father literally moved him from Kitty, which was semi-urban by that time, and who then moved to a school just for him to pass common entrance. So here's a boy from the age of 7 or 8 to prepare you for Queen's College. There's nothing, and where he lived in that area of Georgetown, there's nothing cultic about that. Another individual who comes from that area who talks about the same thing, was Steve Suraj Bali. Steve Suraj Bali always jokes with me that when he went to Indians and he used to tease these coolie boys from countryside. One of the coolie boys in his class was Justice Nandram Kissoon, who came from Beehive.
Well, let me say,
Let me just finish.
in a context which is intellectual.
Oh, yeah.
I don't
Indian.
want the
Okay,
ERC to
no. Okay. So, but
I am not the one who said
and you're
that,
not
right?
saying it. It's a coolie boy saying it. No, the point is though that Chong men, in and of itself, saw Indian in a particular way. You get me at that point in time. And Steve talks about how he stealing the roti from Justice Nandram. He wasn't the Justice Nandram then. The point I want to make is that Rupert was total exposure to culture from a boy, and that's why I use in my column a sequestered, background. So when he entered Queens under that white headmaster, the total cultural upbringing was a Creole one. And but Walter now came out, but Walter came out from a much more quote unquote ghetto-like. Ben Street, crap boy, your area. And Walter had those friends and those inclinations. So in fact, years later, we and I would gaff about this thing, and I would talk about how Walter always felt he could rap and as he said in Jamaica, ground. He pick up the word in Jamaica. But even here, having come from that milieu, he was very comfortable in his skin among black, what we would call lumpen elements. Rupert was not. Walter again founded Queens. Walter is a year ahead of him now. He's 53. Rupert is in 54. And Walter encounters McGowan to teach history, African history. So as a Ford farmer, Rodney writes an article that New World publishes on African slavery, whereas Rupert is doing Elizabethan literature, and he's doing Dickens, and he's doing Latin, and doing Greek. So the upbringing of Rupert, even as a boy, you can contrapose it to things, because in no way, shape, or form did Walter become Creole in that sense. You understand? It was because he was black. So when he went off to UB, he decided to do that kind of history, then goes on to Africa to study upper girls and write his PhD thesis by the time he's 24 and earns his PhD out of London. But this is the difference now. Rupert now, and that's what he told me, he's held back. Because he could have a year and still be 18. You could get a scholarship if you're under 18. So he was held back a year and in fact was prepared 2 years just to get the scholarship, I'm saying. And he won the scholarship in 62, and he gets the scholarship to go to Cambridge. He was of experience there at Cambridge. He had his own room because as a scholarship boy, the room is paid for, the dining is paid for, everything is paid for. He did not encounter any Indians. So that whole Windrush generation that hit London in the 60s, and he was never part of that. Whereas Walter now goes to SOAS, and he is a part of CLR James' study group, totally Afrocentric, totally delving in the question of color, right? CLR had just come up from the 45 Pan-African Manchester Congress, where issues of what independence should mean. Walter is dealing with these issues as a young boy. You understand? Because under the British system, you go straight from your
So
yes.
to put it short, while Walter was researching Africa, Rupert was researching English
literature, very esoteric English literature. The point is that very few people know after Walter finished. So Rupert has never encountered any of the ferment that was going on in London among the West Indians at that point. You understand? Where African students were there, you still had those discussions going on in London that Walter was part and parcel of. Whereas Rupert sequestered away out in Cambridge, never had any part of that. And from there he went directly, believe it or not, nobody talks about it. He spent 2 years in Nova Scotia teaching in a high school. Nova Scotia ain't got no Indian. Very few people. know about
no
those
non-whites
two,
at the time.
no non-whites.
It's a place where
Then
migrants don't go.
he goes to Cornell. You understand? Not part of the Brooklyn crowd. When I went up as late as 72 to go to Brooklyn College, I'm in the heart of where the Caribbean culture
of
is.
course, everybody
Flatbush
knows
Avenue
Brooklyn.
and Canarsie, and I'm dealing with these guys.
That's the Caribbean.
And that's where now Walter would have come and given a talk Students' Union. Because I'm there with Rupert. Rupert is up in there in 76, up to 76. I am in New York, 72, 74. But we are in a Caribbean milieu. I'm living in Brooklyn. You understand? Dealing every day with that. So Rupert's exposure, and this did not come to a knot, was not exposed to Caribbean culture, accepting to what he idealistically saw when he was a little boy. He tells me, and I don't know if I ever put this in my writing, to explain to me his orientation. He said, Ravi, my first girlfriend was a black girl, an African girl. So I said, Rupert, my first girlfriend was an African girl too. Evadne Peters, she's still living in Iflat here. You understand? As a little primary school boy, you don't have those racial things. But Rupert's that was his orientation. So to come back to it, it's not Rupert I want to say. Is that he was put up and I think willingly used by the WPA to talk about multiracialism when Indian culture, which defines your identity with who you are, and to know the hurt culture does to you. I will never forget a column, I'll finish here, that Ian MacDonald wrote about Jock Campbell, who owned Booker's, who'd gone back. And he wrote that Jock Campbell told him to take care of some pensioners, give them a little piece. And I met Campbell personally because of that. Campbell helped my first father-in-law have an operation for his heart at Oxford University. And we always knew Campbell because he kept up with the family. And he was a very humble man, Lord Campbell. I met him at the House of Lords. Anyhow, to come back to Gaia, Ian MacDonald writes about keeping these two sugar workers waiting until finally one day he decides to speak to them and then realize how much knowledge these people had about the sugar industry and about what it was all about. So the point is that this is what Rupert missed, was that what Spivak calls the epistemological violence that is done to Indians in Guyana, that you don't know anything, and the hermeneutical violence, which is you can't explain anything. You understand? And those are terms that Rupert realized when he and I would talk. You know how? And that is where he didn't come naturally to him. It was as an intellectual construct. So I never forget one day we were going to Cara House or Cara Lodge, right? Because he had a room there. Jocelyn Dow gave him a room there, and I have a kidney stone passing through, and I went in there and lied down on his bed. In fact, Alyssa Trotz came in and saw me writhing on this bed. But be as it may, the point that was made at that point, what was I talking? You see, I lose my train of thought sometimes.
You were talking about how he missed that.
Yes. So as we are entering the hotel room, that he talks to me. He said, "Boy, alterity is a bitch, ain't it, Ravi?" No, he would discuss his alterity, otherness, the other. Where we put all of the negative values on others. You get me? The whole process of othering, the fancy name for it is alterity. So Rupert would discuss it from a totally academic sense from his books, right? So as when he would discuss with me his work on Greaves or on Martin Carter. So for example, he could never understand my frustration with Martin Carter to say in his poem that at Black Friday, February 16th, that a city of clerks became men.
I read that and I commented
but
on it.
But Rupert could not explain that to me. That how can't you interrogate Martin? You understand? To say that here, okay, you have Africans who are made into clerks. Yeah, right. So you were saying these rioters who burnt and looted, and you were taking Africans into that nihilism. Right? Thing. But of course, Carter himself would, we didn't want to see. He would then, put that patina over it. It was an act of liberation.
But let's talk about this thing with the PNC. the center force. He wanted to bring the PNC in. Then he started APNU. Joshua Amsami told me he always had a thing more than any one of them with the PNC, even though Andaya's father was the person who seemed to have something going over the decades with the PNC was Rupert. You have an explanation for that?
Well, there are several theories that were put forward, and we can't be